Story 1. I'm a firefighter paramedic. I've seen plenty of people die, but one sticks with me. We responded to a medical call for a patient who was actively dying. He was a terminal lung cancer patient at the end of his life. The family said they had a do not resuscitate order, which means we can let him die in peace without performing all the paramedic interventions. They could not find the paper. I told them to find it or I would have to do things I knew this man did not want. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation, intubation, mechanical ventilation, and other invasive measures that would only slightly prolong his life, invade his body, and not change the eventual outcome. I did what I had to do, but as slowly as I could justify. One of those steps was to attach an electrocardiogram monitor to his chest. There was a pulse and a heartbeat when I did. Then it changed into ventricular fibrillation. This heart rhythm is lethal unless I shock it, and my monitor is programmed to alarm and print a record when it detects it. Rightly so, because this is the beginning of death and something needs to be done right now. As part of the alarm process, the monitor automatically started printing. I prepared to begin the cardiac arrest protocol that nobody in the room wanted when the family finally produced the do not resuscitate papers and I could legally allow him to die without intervention. We completed our paperwork, provided comfort, preserved dignity, and did the other things we do. The monitor had continued printing. The strip shows a pulsing rhythm that became wide and irregular as the heart became hypoxic. Then ventricular fibrillation that started coarse and grew finer and finer until both mechanical and electrical activity stopped. And there was a systole, a flat line. I captured a printout of the moment his heart went from something to nothing. For some reason this case stuck with me. I have seen plenty of death and had many people die in my presence, but this one is the most memorable. I kept that printout for a long time and mentally I still have it. Here 1 minute and gone the next. Story 2. Yes, my wife died. I was at her bedside. She had been unconscious for 5 days and muttered a few words before she slipped away. Story 3. I worked in technical support for a large computer company when the man next to me suddenly fell out of his chair and died. One coworker immediately began cardiopulmonary resuscitation and someone else ran to get the emergency defibrillator. I sat in shock, watching them work until the paramedics arrived and took him away in an ambulance. They were never able to restart his heart. What affected me most was knowing how much he hated his job. I kept wondering whether, in that moment, he realized this was how he would die. Story 4. My immediate family was there when they took my former father-in-law off life support for leukemia. People do not die immediately when that happens. It took about 45 minutes to an hour before the doctor pronounced the time of death. The death rattle was the most unsettling part of it. Story 5. My cousin bled out after being hit by a car. He rolled onto the hood and struck his head on the concrete. It was a festive weekend, so there was traffic everywhere. Paramedics arrived too late. Story 6. I watched my mother suffocate in her hospital bed for approximately 45 minutes. Story 7. I watched my brother die in the hospital from cancer. He was 22 and I was 19. He was holding the bed rail so tightly, then I saw his hand relax. I felt happy for a moment until I realized that meant he had passed. I broke down in tears. Even though I knew he was finally free of pain, I was still in denial that this was the end. Story 8. Too many times. Car crashes, medical emergencies, people being run over, gunshot incidents. I do not know why I have been the person who has witnessed so many of them. You never get used to it. Story 9. I saw my mother die of cancer. At least it was somewhat peaceful. Story 10. I live in Japan and went to a festival near my wife's hometown. The shrine was carried by about 6 men. They were carrying it in front of me when it fell and crushed a man. Everyone was yelling and clapping as usual. I was screaming, "Stop!" Story 11. At a Thanksgiving dinner, my grandmother, who was terminally ill, lay on the bed provided for her in the living room. My brother and I had recently reconciled, and everyone seemed composed. After dinner, she looked at the others, said she was so happy, and breathed her last breath. Story 12. I was 14 and sitting on the couch across the room when a stranger shot my drug dealer cousin point blank in the forehead. I watched my grandmother and my mother die after I signed the paperwork to not resuscitate them. Get a do not resuscitate order. I saw a good friend jump off a tall building. I saw a homeless man be assaulted and die before the police arrived. Story 13. I was lying by my mom's side holding her hand when she died. As someone said to me, she was the first person to hold my hand when I came into this world, and I was the last person to hold hers when she left it. I feel profoundly grateful that my mom had a very quick death. The oncologist had reckoned maybe 10 weeks, but it was 10 days. It was as if she basically switched herself off. She was completely compos mentis to the end, and it was not harrowing to watch her die a slow and painful death, which I know is not the case for many end-of-life patients. I actually have happy memories of her final days because we said everything that needed to be said and she was not suffering. She wanted to die at home. As it became clear death was imminent, my brother, my father, and her closest friend sat with her in my parents' bedroom. Even as she was obviously fading, she opened her eyes, asked my father who was there, and said, "Oh, it'll be a shame if I don't go tonight when you're all gathered here waiting." Then, about half an hour later, her eyes opened again and she said, "Huh, still here." We all burst out laughing. She was my brilliant, funny, loving mother until literally the very end. I remember lying with her, stroking her hair, and telling her she would soon be with her mom and that it was okay to go. It was a privilege to be there. She was far too young to die at 62, but I'm so grateful she had such a good death. Story 14. Yes, she had a heart attack. She was my mother and I was 11. Story 15. I held my mother's hand as she died in 2017 through physician-assisted death in Canada. She was a few months short of her 98th birthday and had advanced cancer. Story 16. I was in the step-down intensive care unit with necrotizing pancreatitis and a severe double infection in my abdomen. My roommate was supposed to be discharged to hospice within a couple of days but did not make it to her discharge date. She died holding her daughter's hand as I heard the child cry out for her. They moved me to my own room for the remainder of my stay. Story 17. My grandma asked my parents if it would be okay to spend her last days in our house. It was a humbling experience, especially at 19. I stayed up late listening to her breathing. It would stop and then start again. When she died, hospice came but only one person arrived, so my dad, the nurse, and I had to carry her out. I still think about her often and wish I had said more, but she knew I loved her. She was the best Grammy I could have had. Story 18. I work in emergency medicine. Death is a common part of life. Western culture has built a curtain in front of it so people can pretend it is not there. I do not think that curtain should exist. If more people actually saw the consequences of bad decisions, such as driving drunk or using a cell phone while driving, treating guns like toys, or smoking and never exercising, they might live healthier, more responsible lives. But here we are. Story 19. I am a pediatric cardiovascular intensive care unit nurse. I saw a lot of children die. One of the worst was a toddler who was in cardiac arrest and had a severe pulmonary hemorrhage. Every time I compressed his chest, blood poured out of his mouth and nose. Story 20. I was working closing shifts and did not have a car. Normally I rode a bicycle to work and back, but my bike had chain problems, so a friend gave me a ride one night and picked me up after work. We had just passed through a poorly lit intersection. About 20 feet past the intersection, an intoxicated man dressed in black stood in the middle of the road. We did not see him until he was right in front of the car. My friend hit the brakes. The man rolled off the hood onto the street. While my friend sat in the car calling the police, I got out to check on him. I was immediately hit with a strong smell of alcohol. He was unconscious, snoring and gasping for air. Both his legs were broken and bent backward at the knees, and there was a pool of blood near his head. An ambulance arrived quickly, and police officers were on scene. They administered field sobriety tests to my friend because he had been driving. We waited at the scene for about 3 hours until a detective arrived. What shocked me was how casual the police officers were about the whole thing. They seemed to know the man and made inappropriate jokes, as if someone had won a contest about him being hit. When the detective finally arrived, he told us the man had died en route to the hospital. They did not charge my friend and released us. I will never forget the snoring, gasping sound he made. Story 21. I witnessed a car accident involving an impatient sport utility vehicle and a semi-trailer truck that was taking a wide turn. The driver had his torso degloved when he collided with the trailer. The only things in his seat were his legs and his spine. To this day, I still cannot eat Twizzlers because they remind me of the spinal cord dangling like bloody roots. Story 22. I saw a man have what I assumed was a heart attack. He collapsed on the sidewalk. Paramedics were called but could not revive him. It is striking how someone can go from alive to gone. When I was a child, my friend's father was driving us home from a movie when a speeding car, going around 90 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone, hit a 20-year-old bicyclist. He bled to death on the street. My friend's father checked on him, but his injuries were too severe. I was young enough that 20 seemed old to me. Story 23. I watched my mother die when I was 16 in her hospital bed. The phenomenon where people improve miraculously before death is real. She had not been able to speak for days and then, all of a sudden, became cognizant and talking. Felt like having my mother with me again. She passed 8 hours later. I cherished that final moment. 11 years later, I was at my grandmother's bedside as she reached up and called my mother's name in her final moments, saying, "It is good to see you again." That hit me hard. Story 24. It was my mom's fiancé. He had a heart attack and died on the living room floor. I was honestly really happy it happened because he was a giant asshole. Story 25. December 31st, 1999. A massive crowd filled the streets of Las Vegas. We were right in front of the Paris balloon. The entire strip was a sea of people. About 10 minutes before the millennium ended, some people were climbing massive traffic lights, crawling out on them, and setting off fireworks. One man stood up and grabbed some overhead wires to balance himself. He was either electrocuted immediately or shocked and then fell to his death. I was filming on an old high-8 camcorder. He fell to the street. A bunch of people gathered around. Paramedics could not get to him. He died. About 8 years later, I was in a bookstore and saw one of those Darwin Award books. I flipped through it and found that very story listed. The book said he was electrocuted, so perhaps that is what killed him, but we did not see sparks or anything. Story 26. Many comments mention heart attacks. Please learn the symptoms of a minor heart attack and the early warning signs that can precede one. People, even those who seem healthy, can die from a heart attack if they miss the early signs. Story 27. I spent 5 days with my mom while she was on hospice, watching her until her last breath. She had Alzheimer's disease, choked on a peach, suffered from aspiration pneumonia, and never recovered. I still cannot get over it. Story 28. I work in a memory care facility. Feels like the end of the line. I couldn't even ballpark how many people I've seen die. Story 29. Countless times. The only ones that stick with me are the kids. I held a little girl's hand while her brain bled internally. She fell off a curb and landed headfirst on pavement. She was so scared. I cried with her while waiting for the ambulance and emergency medical technicians. I promised her she'd be all right. She passed that evening. All the shit I saw working in law enforcement, I can still see her scared face. It was the summer of 2012. It still feels like it happened yesterday. Story 30. Yes. I worked as a lifeguard for a couple of summers at a famously dangerous beach. I saw 2 deaths, but I will describe the one that affected me most. It was September on a very bad day and we had a red flag, meaning no swimming was allowed. A man asked if he could swim, and I told him that even if he were Michael Phelps, no one was swimming that day. 10 minutes later, he moved to the side, as far away from me as he could, and began swimming. I was not sure I could reach him, but colleagues tied a rope to me and I went anyway because he was not far and I could see he was struggling. When I reached him, he was already face down, and I signaled the others to start pulling. When we got him out, he was not breathing, and the ambulance was 30 minutes late. We performed all the procedures, but he did not survive. I still think about it from time to time, but I did what I could. Story 31. Does my dog count? Just in case, he was 10 years old and had aggressive cancer. We discussed surgery, and the veterinarian was honest that at most it would buy him a few months and that he would be in pain. I made the decision to euthanize him. I sang to him, held him, and told him it was okay to go and that I loved him. Then he was gone. I miss you every day, buddy. Story 32. I saw a boy from my cousin's first grade class after he had been hit by a bus in the morning traffic. The bus was still on top of him when I noticed the commotion, and his eyes were open but empty. I was in 5th grade and walking my younger sister and cousins to school as the eldest, so before they could properly look at him, I told them to move along. I said it was fine, that we would see him later, and that we needed to hurry if we did not want to miss the bell. I knew the situation was bad, but I was so calm and casual in the moment that they trusted me and did not learn the truth until the next day. That made all the difference in preventing this from becoming the most traumatic event of their young lives, though I probably did myself a disservice in the process. Story 33. Yes. My fiancée died about 5 years ago. She had been sick for a few days and thought it was just a bad cold. When her cough persisted and became violent, we went to a doctor. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia, prescribed medication, and sent her home. That night she woke me in a panic, signaling me to call an ambulance because she could barely breathe. The paramedics arrived and sat her up in bed, but she was struggling to stay up, so I got behind her and supported her back. As I held her and the paramedics were checking her vital signs, I felt her struggling suddenly stop and she went completely limp. I watched her die and felt her take her last breath while I held her. Later they found she had died of deep vein thrombosis. Story 34. I saw my husband shoot himself in the head from a distance of about 20 feet. That was almost 20 years ago, and I still miss him. I have always worked in healthcare, so I have seen more deaths than I can count. You tend to become compassionate and stoic at the same time. Story 35. Just after getting my solo paragliding license, I joined the local club to start flying. I met one of the club members for a site introduction. I drove him up the mountain and went back to the landing zone to meet him at the bottom. While I was waiting for him, he came down to land and suffered a partial wing collapse. He fell about 100 feet. I ran over and found him barely alive under his wing. I thought he was already dead, but then he began taking rattling gasps. I still fly, but I am very cautious. I have seen what happens when you become complacent. Story 36. Heroin overdoses were extremely upsetting. I never used heroin, but it swept through my punk circle in the 1990s. I knew many people who died. Story 37. The very first time I went to the casino the day I turned 18, I pulled up next to a car. The man in the driver's seat looked at me, put a gun to his head, and pulled the trigger, splattering the interior of the car red and gray. I decided not to gamble. Story 38. Suffocation, drowning, bleeding from a large artery, and sometimes a combination of these. Story 39. I work in a hospital and have been present for many deaths as well as resuscitations. Young people with traumatic injuries are the hardest for me, especially when they arrive awake and then pass away in front of you. Story 40. I cut down someone who was trying to hang themselves. They succeeded, which proved life is a machine. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation made it seem like they were alive, but it was just dead organs reacting. Story 41. I am a paramedic with more than 10 years' experience. I have seen dozens of dead bodies and worked countless cardiac arrests. Usually when I arrive, they are already in cardiac arrest or I manage to keep them from going that far. I can count on one hand how many were conscious when I arrived and then died. It is always harder. The most recent one was a couple of weeks ago. The man was in cardiogenic shock, gray, sweaty, gasping, but able to converse. I gave him oxygen and he perked up. We had about 15 to 20 minutes to build rapport. We exchanged a few jokes until we moved him onto the carry chair to get to the ambulance. Within 30 seconds, he was on the floor and we were breaking ribs. We worked for 2 hours to no avail. Another case was when I first qualified. The man was having an ST elevation myocardial infarction. I gave him all the medications and he felt better. We were about 5 minutes from the hospital when I saw his electrocardiogram make some drastic changes. I asked if he was okay and he said, "Yes, a whole lot better after all that stuff you gave me." Then he went quiet and was in ventricular fibrillation. I tore open his shirt, applied the pads, delivered a 150 joule shock, and did a round of compressions before he started moaning. By the time my paperwork was done, he had one or more stents fitted and was upstairs on the ward with a cup of tea, nursing a couple of sore ribs. Story 42. I was working in a foundry. I was 50 meters away when two coworkers were severely burned by molten aluminum from a dropped crane ladle during a pour. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration seemed to be just a term there, not something people followed. I quit the next day and asked my aunt and uncle to help me get a job in Austria. I never returned. Story 43. I was on the balcony eating dinner, watching a man walking on the other side of the street from my building. I looked down to take a bite, then looked up and he was face down on the sidewalk with a stream of blood coming from his face. I called 911. He must have had a massive heart attack or stroke. An ambulance arrived and took him away. He appeared to be dead. Story 44. Twice. The first was a woman I encountered in jail. She was brought in strapped to a gurney and placed in a suicide watch cell. She had clearly been pepper sprayed. Sometime later that day, she did not respond to the guard checking on her and was found unconscious. She was moved out into the hall and cardiopulmonary resuscitation was started. When the medical team arrived, she was shocked twice and then wheeled out on a gurney. I do not know if they got a pulse back. They did not seem in a huge hurry when they took her out. The second was my grandfather in hospice. Fuck cancer. Story 45. My ex-girlfriend and I were at her mother's bedside in the hospital. Her last words were to tell me to take care of her daughter and that I am a good man for her. Story 46. I don't like getting emotional, but I lost my youngest daughter to suicide. It began in July 1993. I came home for lunch one day. I usually do not come home for lunch, but I made an exception. I remembered that I had gone to the deli the day before and picked up pastrami and fresh mozzarella. I wanted to make myself a sandwich instead of asking my wife to make it when I got off work. I pressed the garage door opener, and the garage door began to open. I stood in the driveway waiting for it to open completely. When it did and I walked into the garage, I saw my daughter hanging from the ceiling. I hit the brakes, jumped out, and ran toward her. Her body was motionless. I managed to cut her down. I am a rather tall man. I am 6 feet 11 inches tall. I knelt with my daughter lying in the garage and checked for a pulse. There was a faint pulse. I called emergency services on speakerphone and began cardiopulmonary resuscitation as the dispatch operator guided me, and an ambulance was sent to my residence. I was unsuccessful in reviving her. The paramedics tried for an additional 15 minutes and attempted defibrillation. Nothing worked. After another minute or so, I knelt down, took my daughter's hand, and said my goodbyes. At some point I called my wife at work and gave her the awful news. That is all for now. I am going to close. Story 47. I am a hospitalist and this is the only funny patient death I ever had. A man was 97 with no significant health problems. He arrived awake and alert and in no pain, but he had fallen and broken his hip. He was pleasant but somewhat hard of hearing, so I had to speak loudly as I explained that he was likely going to die that night. A pelvic fracture had sheared several veins and there was no way to surgically repair them. I was bracing for one of the most difficult discussions in medicine. His eyes lit up. He, hand on his heart, exclaimed, "Yippee! No fooling." His granddaughter was sitting next to him. She smiled and began to tear up. Apparently his wife, his children, his siblings, and almost everyone he knew except his grandchildren had died. He had been lonely and had wanted to die for some time. Unfortunately, he was otherwise healthy and would not die. He celebrated, saying how relieved he was, and his granddaughter laughed and cried. I had never been more flummoxed. A few hours later, once he was upstairs, we gathered the family and I gave them the end-of-life care discussion. We decided on comfort measures, anxiety medications, whatever food he wanted, beer we could order in the hospital, and as much morphine as he wished. The goal was to ease suffering and anxiety, not to cure him. We expected him to die soon, so the family kept a vigil all night and into the next day. but he remained alive. He held on for 4 days, slowly bleeding into his pelvis but not dying. The family finally ended the vigil one night and he was alone for a few hours. When I checked on him, he was dead, mouth open and head tilted back. I was genuinely happy for him. He finally got what he wanted. His last experience was being surrounded by his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and he slipped away after finishing his beer and cake. That man was the coolest patient I ever met. Rest in peace, Mr. P. Story 48. My significant other's father died while I was trying to resuscitate him. He had a heart attack and my partner found him. I am not the same. I miss him so much. Story 49. I held my grandmother's hand as she passed away in hospice. Felt strange. Nearly the entire family was there with her, but my focus was locked on her as if no one else were around. I heard my mother and my aunts tell her it was okay to go. Then I saw the light leave her. As 1 second she was there and the next she was not. I was 18. It was the most devastating day of my life. I was so emotional that I had to run to the bathroom and vomit. Despite the emptiness that followed, I would not change being there to hold her hand one final time. Story 50. In Canada, medical assistance in dying is available. People can apply to receive a powder mixed with liquid, fall asleep, and not wake up. It can spare them days or weeks of suffering at the end of life. Story 51. I had a very close friend I called my brother who died in my arms from M30 pills. I had never used anything stronger than weed before that, and afterward I became a hardcore addict to many substances. Story 52. My mom had a severe aneurysm. She was in the hospital for about a month before we had to decide to withdraw life support because she was not improving. She had been perfectly healthy, exercised every day, ate a healthy diet, and never smoked or drank alcohol. It is shocking that this can happen to anyone. Story 53. I was on a cross-country road trip with my wife. Driving through the Arizona desert, we saw a 4Runner type vehicle that had flipped over multiple times. By the time we passed, a passenger appeared to be gravely injured and likely did not survive. My wife was left traumatized by the scene. Story 54. Many people. Some suffer traumatic injuries, others have medical issues. Some are old, some are young. Death is indiscriminate. Paramedic. Story 55. I held my mother's hand as she died from complications of dementia. She was unconscious all day and had a death rattle that I heard. It was sad but also a relief because she had to be placed in the memory care unit with 24-hour supervision after attacking other residents in general care. She had never been violent before the disease took over and she hated being there from the first day away from home. My father died from severe heart valve disease. I stayed and worked from home while he was in the hospital, but I could not provide the long-term, daily care her increasing needs required. Story 56. I am a respiratory therapist in a trauma center, so at least once a week. Story 57. I'm a 75-year-old male and a widower. I have lost people more times than I want to count. A drowning, some due to disease, some from old age, a few as a result of traumatic accidents, and quite a few when I was in Vietnam during the war from bullets and explosives. Keep in mind, I am an older person and have lived many years. During the first 10 years of my life, we lived in isolation. We did not have any doctors within many miles, much less hospitals or ambulances. I never saw a doctor until I was 11. So people in my area mostly died at home, sometimes of conditions a doctor might have treated if we had had access. For instance, I was standing there when each of my paternal great-grandparents died. He went first. She died maybe 3 months later. All I ever knew was old age. Great-grandfather was 105 when he died in 1959. Great-grandmother was 98. I was 9. When I was 11, my brother John, age 3, died in my arms from infant pneumonia. We did not have money for penicillin, and the only doctor we knew who would let us make payments was on vacation. Yes, there have been many. Some losses were a different kind of hurt, like my wife. She had a heart attack. By the time they put her on machines, it was too late. I was told it had been too long and she was essentially brain dead. At best, there would have been so much brain damage that she would never be the same. She and I had discussed such things. It had been her wish not to live as a vegetable or with such brain damage that she would be helpless. I had promised her I would honor that wish, and I did. I kissed her goodbye and turned off the machines that were keeping her body alive. My children, adults, were very angry with me because I did not wait. They felt I should have called and given them time to get to the hospital. I was not going to do that. Turning off those machines was tough enough without them there, crying and pleading for me to reconsider because they would have. It is hard to end the life of someone you love more than yourself. I do not know if I could have resisted their pleading. I had to do it, so I did. They forgave me eventually, but it took a while. I kept having to explain that they had nothing to say about it. I had promised my wife, and it was between her and me, no one else. Story 58. I was coming out of a Domino's pizza with my mom when we saw a person slumped over the steering wheel of a car. It had been a shooting. It happened before we arrived because we had ordered by phone. The police were just starting to set up the scene, so I saw it before it was covered up. At first, we did not notice. Another time, when I was leaving school, I looked to my right to turn toward the street to go home and saw a man lying flat and not moving. People were around him, but he did not respond. I took a detour. Story 59. A man was driving recklessly on the highway, cutting people off and swerving from the left lane to the right. He went into the dirt, lost control, flipped his car, and was ejected, losing his right arm. His dog, which was with him, was also killed. Story 60. Not going to bother listing them all from my time as an emergency medical technician. There were many: gunshot wounds, drownings, burn victims with smoke inhalation, overdoses, falls, cardiac arrests, ejections from cars. It is a long list. Personally, there were 3. Each involved a different type of drug, though for 2 of them it was hard to tell whether it was the aftermath or that I had been too late. It is far worse when it is someone you know well, because after years of ambulance runs and fire calls you expect to feel more than you actually do. Story 61. My baby was born with severe hydrocephalus. Fluid built up inside his brain before birth and crushed it against the inside of his skull. He was on a respirator for a few days, and they finally told me he had no brain activity. I asked them to remove him from the respirator. A nurse dragged a rocking chair from the neonatal intensive care unit into a room across the hall. I sat in that chair, cuddled him, and rocked him until his heart stopped beating. He would have been 43 this year. Story 62. I watched my mother die. She had cancer and multiple strokes and was bedridden and essentially unresponsive for a few days before her death. Her breathing became very fast and deep in the last few hours. My boyfriend and I went out to get some food. We were gone about 10 minutes, and when we returned, she took her last breaths. It was surreal. Story 63. I saw a car crash into a tree. The driver appeared to have fallen asleep. 4 young people got out. There were no visible injuries or blood, but they were clutching themselves and clearly in intense pain. They seemed to be dying and were in mortal terror before they suddenly stopped moving. I have seen other people die in the military, but this was especially surreal and disturbing, and it has stuck with me more than the others. Story 64. Yes, I watched my mother die in December of last year. She had pancreatic cancer. It was horrible. Story 65. As a 13-year-old, I saw an old man cross the bus lane right in front of our driver. We all had to get off the bus. It was a traumatic sight. Story 66. Not me, but my sister saw a man call for help until he stopped moving in a McDonald's parking lot after being shot. She was 16. Story 67. I was in the room when my grandmother died, and she was brought back even though she had a do not resuscitate order. I was also in the room when my aunt was told she had only hours to live, and her son's family, who were rushing back from vacation, might not make it in time. She had walked into the hospital 2 days earlier with back pain and was found to have 2 stage 4 cancers and double pneumonia. That was arguably worse. My last memory was her saying she was not ready to die. Story 68. In 1980, in grade 10, I was walking home from school, standing at a busy intersection waiting for the light to change. A boy ran past me against the light and into traffic and was hit by a car. I was only slightly aware it was happening. I heard the crash, then turned to see him pinwheeling through the air. He landed upside down with a sickening crunch directly on his head. I ran to him. He was face down in the street. I rolled him over and cradled his head in my lap. Blood poured out everywhere. I recognized him as a popular senior who played on several sports teams, but I did not know his name. He looked up at me with incredibly blue eyes, a mixture of shock and confusion. As I watched, his eyes went from bright blue to medium blue to dull gray as the life drained from him. His lips moved wordlessly. He made a gurgling sound, then went limp. Sometime later, the emergency medical technicians arrived. After quickly checking for a pulse, they declared him dead and did not attempt resuscitation. When they picked him up to put him on a gurney, the back of his head opened like a trapdoor and some brain matter fell onto the pavement. The emergency medical technicians gave me towels to mop up the blood covering me. The police took my statement and I was sent home. As I walked through the crosswalk, I saw the boys' Adidas sneakers, laces still tied, one step apart, not even knocked over. When I got home, my mother was initially angry at me for ruining my pants until I explained what had happened. We never really spoke of it again. I largely forgot about it. No one received counseling in those days. In 1994, 14 years later, my wife and I were watching Star Trek: The Next Generation. There is a scene where Geordi connects cables to Data's head, and when he presses a button, a flap opens on his head. I sobbed uncontrollably and frightened my wife. I required multiple counseling sessions to handle emotions I had never dealt with at the time. Story 69. Only once. My uncle had a huge heart attack and, despite being clinically dead for a few minutes, he was resuscitated but left with severe brain damage. He was in the hospital for 6 months. 2 weeks before they were going to move him to a specialist facility, he had another heart attack but survived. I was in the room with him the next day. He was on a ventilator but barely breathing. I watched his chest rise and fall. Then it stopped. His face showed no expression. He was gone. Story 70. I saw my father die. He had a stroke that finally took him. He was taken to the hospital, transferred, and entered a vegetative state. My mother called and, with the doctor on the line, said he was being placed in hospice. I had no idea what that meant, and my wife, at the time, who worked in healthcare, did not say anything. Something told me to go back. I lived in another state. I bought a ticket for the next day but had to fly into a city farther away than usual. An aunt and uncle picked me up and took me straight to the hospital. They were there along with my mother and me. My father had his breathing support removed and was breathing heavily. After being in that room for about 45 minutes, my father stopped breathing. My mother said he would stop and start breathing again, but this time, he did not. I am convinced my father held on until I could be there so he could hear me one last time. I am an only child. I was the last one to leave that room. I thanked him for everything he taught me about being a father. My first child was due in a couple of months. This was the day of the insurrection. I had no idea what had happened in the District of Columbia until over a week later. Story 71. A stranger, an elderly woman, died in the street. A man died after being involved in a traffic collision. Both were beyond saving, but I held their hands so they did not die alone. Story 72. I watched my mother die. She lived a lifetime of excess eating, drinking, and smoking. I thought I would feel something but did not. Once I actually realized she was gone, I shed a few tears, although I was not sad. Her death 6 months ago has brought so much peace to my life. She was essentially a child 23 years older than me, someone I did not choose. Story 73. I watched my grandmother die on the inside when she saw my grandfather pass away. That hurt more than her death. She kept telling him to wake up. Story 74. I previously worked in a mental health inpatient unit. Once a month we held a barbecue for patients and staff. It was usually a fun day because it broke the monotony. Earlier this year I was in the client kitchen handing out food with a few other staff when a patient came in to get his juice from the fridge. He was not a big talker, possibly because of his schizophrenia and autism, so his silence was not unusual. Suddenly he started shuffling and seemed stuck in the fridge. My colleagues went to help maneuver him out when he turned blue and collapsed. We realized he was choking. I remember calling the emergency team and activating my duress alarm. Our nurses and doctors responded quickly, but the food was lodged too far down his throat for them to save him. He died on the floor of the small kitchen where I used to bake cookies and cupcakes with patients. Later, I read he had about 15 centimeters of bun in his esophagus. I cannot comprehend how that happens. I had done a lot of work in supervision and therapy because I was having intrusive thoughts about witnessing someone self-harm or attempt suicide. I did not prepare to watch someone choke to death on a sausage in a bun. I still think about his Nana, who visited most days even though she was 82. She had so much hope for his recovery after his recent decline. I learned he had a daughter who had never met him. He was only a couple of years older than me, not yet 40. Even though I am not a medical professional, the what-ifs haunted me for a while. It is not an experience I am in a hurry to repeat. Story 75. I was a long-time addict. I have seen too many people overdose. Some I was able to bring back. Others died. Friendly reminder: always carry naloxone, brand name Narcan, even if you do not think you will ever need it. For real, the last person I revived I almost did not stop to check on because they looked homeless and were napping in the Walmart parking lot. Thankfully, I keep naloxone, brand name Narcan, in my car and one on my keychain. Now I do not care about potentially waking someone from a nap if there is a chance they need help. Story 76. First, a man had a heart attack at work. He collapsed. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation did nothing, and we did not have a defibrillator. I cannot remember his name 30 years later. Second, a woman had a brain aneurysm and immediately collapsed and died at a music concert I was attending. Third was my father. He had been a heavy smoker throughout his adult life and worked in construction until cancer overtook him and a tumor wrapped around major organs. I held his hand, told him I loved him, and watched him die. He was a sweet giant of a man who deserved to see his grandchildren grow up. The most disturbing of these was my father. Not because he was my father, but because the death rattles and the body struggling to stay alive are a god-awful thing to witness. By the way, do not smoke. It is a hard, fucking death. First, a man had a heart attack at work. He collapsed. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation did nothing, and we did not have a defibrillator. I cannot remember his name 30 years later. Second, a woman had a brain aneurysm and immediately collapsed and died at a music concert I was attending. Third was my father. He had been a heavy smoker throughout his adult life and worked in construction until cancer overtook him and a tumor wrapped around major organs. I held his hand, told him I loved him, and watched him die. He was a sweet giant of a man who deserved to see his grandchildren grow up. The most disturbing of these was my father. Not because he was my father, but because the death rattles and the body struggling to stay alive are a god-awful thing to witness. By the way, do not smoke. It is a hard, fucking death. First, a man had a heart attack at work. He collapsed. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation did nothing, and we did not have a defibrillator. I cannot remember his name 30 years later. Second, a woman had a brain aneurysm and immediately collapsed and died at a music concert I was attending. Third was my father. He had been a heavy smoker throughout his adult life and worked in construction until cancer overtook him and a tumor wrapped around major organs. I held his hand, told him I loved him, and watched him die. He was a sweet giant of a man who deserved to see his grandchildren grow up. The most disturbing of these was my father. Not because he was my father, but because the death rattles and the body struggling to stay alive are a god-awful thing to witness. By the way, do not smoke. It is a hard, fucking death. Story 77. My grandfather died of lung cancer. This was in the 1980s, and he had never seen a doctor until one day he passed out in the alley and was missing for 8 hours. He did not want to die in the hospital, so we took him home. He was already advanced when they found it. He died exactly 2 months after he was diagnosed. He was my whole world as a little girl. He taught me to cook. He had been a cook in the army. He taught me about science. He knew a lot about his garden, the outdoors, and animals. His legs became so thin before he died that you could wrap your fingers around them. It was a terrible way to die. A nurse came every hour at the end to drain fluid from his lungs because he had a death rattle from fluid buildup. My mother kept telling him, "It's okay. We will be okay." All of us women were with him. He always said he was surrounded by women, and at the end he was. He had already passed by the time the priest arrived to administer last rites, only by minutes. My mother had stepped out of the room for a minute to call my grandmother. When my grandmother returned and saw him, she screamed that she did not think he was breathing. That was the end. My grandfather was Catholic, the son of an Irish immigrant to the United States. He wanted to be buried with his parents, and he could not without last rites. They are buried in an old Catholic cemetery. Lung cancer is a terrible way to die. Story 78. I watched my 5-year-old daughter die from leukemia. She had been in a coma for several days. They let me hold her while they removed life support. She had some jerking motions, which I was told were caused by her nervous system, and she died a minute later. It is an image I will never forget. It is haunting. Story 79. I've worked in a nursing home for 22 years. For most residents, the final stage is respiratory failure once their condition begins to shut the body down. Story 80. A man at my old job was crushed by a dock plate. He had been working on it while everyone else was at lunch, which he had been told not to do. The safety mechanism was not secured or set up correctly, and the plate came down suddenly. We managed to lift the plate, lay him on the ground, and attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but it was too late. There was no visible gore, but he was not breathing. Story 81. I saw someone on the sidewalk being stabbed repeatedly while I was stuck in traffic. It was on the news that night. The man died from his injuries. Story 82. My grandmother died at the beginning of the year in her nursing home. The home staff called my parents because she was going quickly. By the time we arrived, she was slipping into agonal breathing, so we knew it was time. Her breaths became more shallow and less frequent, and after a few minutes she gave a small, quick exhale. That was her last. It is one of those moments that sticks with you. You remember the smell, the sight, and the feel of the environment vividly. We are at peace knowing she went relatively quickly and was surrounded by family, and if I were in her position, that is how I would want to go. Story 83. When I was almost 7, my grandparents' neighbor had a widowmaker heart attack in front of his wife, my granddad, and me. We were all talking for a bit. Then he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and fell into the bushes. I still remember how his wife sounded as she screamed for him to get up and be all right. Story 84. My father-in-law had a hemorrhagic brainstem stroke. After 10 days, the decision was made to remove him from life support. Story 85. I was driving to school one morning and an ambulance was in front of me. We kept stopping at red lights, so every time I stopped behind them I could clearly see what they were doing inside the vehicle. At one stop, I saw them fail to save the patient and then pull a blanket over the body. In retrospect, I do not know why they did not have their sirens on to get traffic to move out of the way. Another time, I did not witness the death, but a cashier at a gas station next to the building where I worked was shot and killed in a robbery. My boss owned both buildings and was on vacation, so I assisted the police by accessing the security footage. As a result, I saw her body in the footage. It was a strange feeling to see someone like that after speaking with her less than 24 hours earlier. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.